Good afternoon, everybody. We're in track F4, State Floodplain Management Initiatives, and welcome, the last track of the day. There will be 4 presentations today, so we're going to go a few minutes long, but I'm told not much long. Our first presenter is Celinda Adair, who is the Oregon State Floodplain Management Coordinator.
Today's presentation focuses on the tools and strategies that I use at the state of Oregon and Roxanne at FEMA Region 10 use to coordinate our work and to communicate so that we can achieve our common goals and purposes, which is really to help local communities and to move forward the priorities of the National Flood Insurance Program in a way that avoids duplication and builds strong relationships and trust. The 3 topics we're going to focus on today are the 3 C's: communication, collaboration, and consistency. We're going to take some time to tell you guys our story a bit and also highlight some of the specific practices that we use that help us with these 3 things and help us achieve our strong coordination. A couple of things to note. One is that all these tools may not work for your community or for your state and region. The important thing we'd like to highlight is that you take time to find what does work for you. It doesn't have to be the same approach, but achieving a good, strong system of communication, collaboration, and consistency really makes this work a lot easier for both of us and a lot more effective and efficient. The first thing we'll talk about is communication, and I know it's been said many times how important communication is in many presentations, and so in a sense Sears is the broken record, but it still holds true. One of the most important things we focus on is being very transparent with each other. So Roxanne and I work really closely, and she does a really great job of making time each week for us to check in. And what I do is I send her through during the week, or she sends me little emails, little notices about what's going on. It could be a general technical assistance or request from help from the local community. And so we'll forward on anything that's controversial, anything that's complicated, or anything that requires, a fair bit of in-depth guidance for a local community. I'll forward those on to her. She'll send things through to me. And weekly, we'll check in and run through them. So instead of touching base, 8 or 10 times for 15 minutes or half an hour, we have 1 hour or less chat, and we just drill through the topics. And that really helps us stay on the same page. We also share updates about what's going on at both the FEMA region and the state, and the work we're doing during that week or the next few weeks during those weekly check-ins. They're quite an efficient, effective measure that we use. The other thing we do is we're try very hard to be transparent about our perspectives on providing advice and guidance to local communities. And we take a lot of effort to discuss that prior to engaging local communities. So if we're going to have a call with a local floodplain manager to go over a very complicated issue regarding a controversial permit per se, Roxanne and I will take a few minutes before that to touch base and make sure we're on the same page, or to share our different perspectives, different research, really what we've dug into and developed that can help this local floodplain manager. And if we have areas where we differ or we're looking at it from a different perspective, we talk it through and come to unified guidance so that the local communities are getting what they really want, which is just one clear, concise answer, rather than us talking it through verbally on the phone with the communities. If we're doing a lot of back and forth, it tends to just confuse them. And it also creates a lot of inefficiency of our time if we're doing that during the call with the local community. So doing that beforehand really helps us and hopefully gives the best outcome for the local community. The last thing I'm going to talk about is common tracking tools. So I know we all know and love CIS, and we all use it, and all need to continuously use it. However, sometimes some of the work we do benefits from additional tracking tools that we create ourselves that are just tailored to the way we think and we work. And then that information still goes into CIS, but It gives us something light and easy to use that's really fitted for this small component of the work we do. For example, we had 42 ordinance reviews come up because of risk map projects that all needed to be done within 2 to 3 months back in 2018. And to make sure that we could get through those, because at the time we were doing joint state and FEMA reviews, it was really important that we had a separate tracking tool. So we built a simple spreadsheet that tracked each of the steps each of us needed to do for the ordinance reviews, the status, when we'd received them, when we contacted with the community. And we'd flick that back and forth once or twice a week. So instead of me sending her 100 individual emails letting her know that I'd done the next thing on this ordinance and that ordinance, we were able to just shift that back and forth and keep track really effectively with a little summary of in the email of next steps. So I'd send Roxanne something like, all right, I've done this one, see the ordinance, or see the ordinance tracking spreadsheet, but I kind of highlight, these are the 2 things I really need from you. And she was great. She'd respond really quickly to that. So it worked really well because we could highlight our top urgent needs in the email, and then we had the tracking spreadsheet that we could really go back and forth. Ideally, someday we get that put in a place we can both access it online when our IT departments can agree on that. But for now, those little side spreadsheets really go a long way sometimes, or other tools that we use. And I'll turn it over now to Roxanne to talk a little bit more about our supportive measures.
Thanks, Celinda. I think one of my most favorite things we do for each other is to facilitate or mediate difficult conversations. There are times when you, Celinda, have got way more information and education on what we may be talking with to the local community. And you know what? There's just times when each of us may be having an off day. I love the fact that both of us have the ability to get in the conversation and facilitate or mediate when they seem to be going the wrong direction and turn that around for the other. You talked about those emails that we send back and forth. And I love that we do that because it does allow us to each have some lead time to process that information. And then when we get together for our weekly calls, we're ready to go. There's no time that we have to spend going over what we're going to be discussing beforehand. We have shared outreach efforts that we do. There are several documents that you've been able to create that I've been able to use in my FEMA role. And again, I like that because that helps us almost like the common tracking tools did that you talked about. We are able to use the same approach and some of the same documents, which really helps make it consistent for the community. And the last thing is acting as each other's listening board. No matter how smoothly things go, there's always those days where you need to be able to reach out and talk and discuss things that are going well or things that aren't. And I love that we do that for each other. Let's start our first example, or talk about our first example, which is about disaster assistance in Eastern Oregon and how that demonstrates how we communicate best.
Thanks, Roxanne. So in February 2020 in Eastern Oregon, focused largely in Umatilla County and the surrounding areas, we had a record flood that came in. And this was one of the first flood events that has happened that was of large scale while I've been in this role. So I have had a little bit of a learning curve, as when I dealt with flood events previously, I was in the map mod role, and that's a slightly different response gig. So one of the really important things here was immediately I started, as I'm working with the communities, I started also working with Roxanne and copying her in on all that communication. And as I'm reaching out to Silver Jackets for help with high water marks and these different parties and entities, I kept copying Roxanne. And then daily we would check in, and she was just this great supportive force there, providing me with more information, more materials, more resources. I went out after really the day after it crested and did substantial damage training for the local communities. And I had such a short time frame to put some of that information together. Some of our outreach materials had been a bit out of date, our really in-depth large ones. And so Roxanne really was great. She was reviewing, while I'm driving out there, she was reviewing my presentation, providing materials, just helping slot in that supportive role and really helping so that I could go out and do a good, strong outreach effort. She participated in that call. And a couple of things that was good was she reviewed what we had at the state of Oregon for substantial damage. And we worked together really tightly to make sure we were doing consistent messaging. We talked about the expectations we had for the locals, the expectations for the state role, the expectations for FEMA Region 10, to make sure we were really clear on the same page of who is going to be doing what with this disaster, both during and after it, to help the communities and to focus especially in on the floodplain management and substantial damage aspect. And what really shone for me of why that was so important was I had a family emergency come up right in the middle of all this, and I literally had to go and hop on a plane and take off. And because I had been involving Roxanne so closely and working so closely with her, it was a huge moment of, oh gosh, I don't want to leave all these people hanging. And then this great relief of, oh wait, it's going to be okay because Roxanne knows what's going on. And she was so wonderful to be able to step in and support me that it really made it work so that I could take off and not be stressing the whole time, feeling like I'd left all these communities in the lurch. So it really is beneficial to do this type of close coordination. It can take a little extra time, but I can't say enough about it in terms of the rewards when something happens and you do need that support. And Rex, do you want to talk about your experience with this one?
This was an amazing experience. Not amazing for the amount of damage that was done or for the survivors, but for the fact that I really think our communication was top form at this time. We stayed involved with each other. You were out with those communities immediately and able to hold training, which you kindly let me dial in on. So by me being there and not being there at the same time, we were able to give a really consistent message to the communities that we do work together. I really liked watching how both the state and some of the communities really stepped up during this event. It was amazing to watch some of the larger communities just help and encourage the smaller communities and offer to help them with some of the difficult tasks that they had ahead of them. I also really like that you had kept me involved so that when I was out there with our individual assistance team, I already had a really good idea of where I needed to focus my attention, which communities did need some extra help. And that just set the whole thing up. Again, a tragic event, but a really good example of the communication we've built between ourselves. Do you want to start talking about collaboration next?
I think that's a great idea. So part of our collaboration really focuses on coordination. We already talked a bit about the weekly check-ins and how we do that to discuss kind of issues that have come up during the week. We also do that to talk about our work plan and where we're going for the next few weeks, so that if Roxanne's going to be engaging a community, I'm aware of it and vice versa. One of the key things that we try to do is do forward planning together. We look at the next quarter's activities. We look at what timeline and schedule we've got set up. And I don't know about other state coordinators, but sometimes we have so many balls in the air at the same time that it's good to almost take that time to do a little run through and say, all right, this is how I think the schedule is going to go. And then weekly, as we get closer, if things get bumped around, it's easy for them to track what's going to happen and for me and Roxanne to track. It's also really good that we keep each other informed. So during state legislative sessions, as I'm responding to proposed legislation and bills, I'm able to just give Roxanne a heads up about that. And what's great is that she takes the time to track it and stay abreast of it too, so that when I need a little bit of FEMA weight behind something to help push, she's there to provide it, which really helps. And the same thing goes the other way as FEMA's policies are changing, new draft guidance is coming out. Roxanne does a really great job of giving me a heads up, and we have chats about, okay, well, what are we working on right now? What are we working on the next quarter that could be impacted on this? And if there's nothing there, we still have a chat a little bit about what's coming down the pipeline and what that would mean for, say, the model ordinance or for different things. So by keeping each other informed of what's coming, it really takes some of that getting, blindsided. It removes that element and makes it a lot easier to track what's coming down and respond to it decently. Rox, what do you want to say about coordination?
We share a lot of really great ideas, and I think we come up with some really great ideas. But what I like even more is that we're always taking the time to make sure we're talking to each other before we implement those, to ensure that it still keeps things consistent between FEMA and state, and also doesn't go against either one of our agencies' goals. We're also learning too, I think everybody is, that in this situation that we're currently in, email has become the primary form of communication. And I think we've realized that sometimes that isn't the best way to communicate, that sometimes we need to have separate discussions on the phone where we can talk things through, because we all know that email can be read with a different intent than what it was meant to be. I also like this last bullet because I think that it goes with every single one of the previous bullets. We like to document our conversations and decisions. It's never done maliciously or to one-up each other. It's always done so that we can support each other if these discussions come up in other areas. It's also nice to be able to document things so that if somebody asks me, hey, do you know Celinda has done this or has done that, I'm easily able to pull up the documented conversation through email and be able to show how we made decisions or had conversations. I think we've got a great example of collaboration with the shared community visit we did with the City of Madras.
Thanks, Rox. Yes, the City of Madras was scheduled for a community assistance visit, and I've been doing them for a while in Oregon and getting used to the Region 10 approach. And Roxanne and I decided it was really a good time, because she was going to be in that area anyways, for us to do one together so that we could really see how the other one was doing them, what materials we were using, how we were framing and contextualizing the conversation, and making sure the information we were sharing and the messaging was consistent, so that when we're out doing other community assistance visits and community assistance contacts, we knew we were always going to be on the same page. It was also a good thing because I had just finished developing some model floodplain development permit forms, some standard operating procedures for processing floodplain permits, an example of those to give communities, and some other tools, outreach tools. And it was great to roll those out and get Roxanne's feedback, et cetera, and to show and share those. I mean, I'd sent them to her before and we'd kind of reviewed them, but to go over them and practice together with a local community was a good experience. And once again, just helped maintain that we were on the same page and doing our CABs and CACs in a consistent manner, so that two communities, whether it's FEMA or the state there, are always going to be getting the same approach and information. And the other thing that we did was I went out a little bit ahead and did a field tour inspection, and I shared some of that information with her. And it helped to get a second perspective on a couple of things, because they did have a few tricky issues with some pre-existing development within the last 5 years. So Rex, what do you think about this experience?
I thought this experience was wonderful because we were able to see how we each act or relate in a CAB to the local community. I had two biggest lessons learned. The first was that I usually go into a CAB using my computer and oftentimes taking notes on the computer, whereas during this visit, I saw you interact face-to-face and take your notes longhand. I really think that that's an important lesson that I need to keep in mind with whichever community I'm doing a CAB with. Some are okay with the computer, but in this case, I really think that face-to-face communication was best. The other is there was an issue with the city of Madras that they had questions on. And we had been unable to effectively communicate via email. And because of this, we were able to talk about it in the room, which helped greatly. And once it was explained, I was able to understand what was happening much better. And we were able to work forward with a solution. How about we talk about consistency?
Great. So we focus on consistency because of the importance it holds for all of our communities. We've got over 260 participating communities in Oregon, and it's really important to them and everybody involved in the program that they get consistent guidance on how to implement the NFIP and how to conduct floodplain management, so that they are, you know, if you live in one city and you live in a county and your property's on the line, you're not getting completely different messages. And local floodplain managers, to understand and build on their knowledge, having consistency and guidance is really important. So a couple things we do is during those weekly conversations, we flag with each other on any responses we're giving to local communities where we're providing kind of new guidance or unique guidance. So there's some stuff we probably responded to 100 times, and so we don't necessarily need to share those. But if it's something a little strange, something a little unique, or something we haven't really dove into before, we'll always flag that with the other person, and we'll take the time to kind of write down and put into writing the guidance we shared and put the reasoning in the background. It can be a little longer email than we normally send to a community, but we do that and we share it with the other person. And if we need to, we talk about it beforehand so that we have kind of now set this is the standard. You know, and obviously we have technical bulletins, we have all of our guidance, but putting that into one clear interpretation for how that applies to a unique situation and making a written record of that and sharing that between us so that we'll be consistently using that going forward is really good. And it really helps the local communities and avoids us duplicating things in the future, duplicating that work. So whenever I do that or she does that, we always copy it to the other person so that if I get asked the same question, I don't go put in all that effort. And it helps during our weekly calls. We talk about which communities have reached out to us. We can always go check CIS, etc. But sometimes if it's during the same week, you know, the same day, it's just really good to flick something on and let them know, like I let Roxanne know, or she lets me know, hey, I've talked to these couple communities about these issues. And that way, it avoids some of that shopping around where communities will call 6 different folks and get different answers. It ensures that we know who they're talking to and we give them a consistent answer. I think the other thing that is important is sometimes the hardest thing to do is to recognize whose authority it is when we have something that falls into a bit of a gray area or isn't the most clear, and we have different perspectives on how it should be interpreted pertaining to a unique situation. And a community is the regulating body in Oregon and has the official decision to regulate, but the guidance we're giving them, it's important sometimes to recognize who has the final authority in interpreting what FEMA policies are. And Roxanne and I do a good job of not letting that get into a personal point of kind of fighting back and forth over this is my opinion, this is ours. We both voice our opinions, our perspectives, the reasonings, and we work through. And then I think we do a good job of honoring in specific situations whose final authority it has if we can't come to agreement. Rox, do you want to talk a little bit more about our unified approach?
Sure. We always like to check in with each other before we talk to a community or offer guidance on really complicated issues. To me, this just helps us become more consistent in our messaging to the community. And it also ensures that we are checking in with each other on these higher level decisions that might need to be made. And also, we really take the time to notice in an active conversation if a difference of opinion is developing between us. And if it is, we have the agreement with each other that if we're on the phone with the community or somebody else, that we take it offline to discuss. They are never going to mind if we tell them that we need to regroup and get back to them. And I think taking that extra step just really goes to show how unified we are. I think we have one last example in regard to our consistency, that is the state model ordinance.
And for the purposes of time, I'll just keep this one brief. We have the State of Oregon Model Flood Ordinance that we developed. And what I really want to stress here is that we worked on this quite closely together. I pulled together things from our previous ordinance, put in the guidance and information. But what really made this work was that at the very beginning, we identified the roles of each agency and the expectation for what kind of feedback process and review process we do. We decided to do a joint effort with this. So I drafted things up, but periodically they would be reviewed by FEMA Region 10 staff, both Karen and Roxanne. And as we'd move forward through that process and they'd give me feedback and we'd have conversations about different perspectives, we were tracking that. So we had a record of why the decisions were made to put the language that's in there. And as we move forward, what that gave us at the end was a product that I could provide to local communities and say 100% FEMA approves this as meeting the minimum compliant standards. And there was an email reference of that and a bit of a formal review process. So there's a record that this document as it stands is officially something communities can trust and rely on, whether it's me using it to do an ordinance review or Roxanne using it. And the other thing that was great was that both of us made that commitment to use this consistent tool and the review checklist that goes with it. And so I thought that was a really well spent effort. It takes a little bit longer, but it's worth it. Rox, do you have anything else to share with this one?
No, I think you did a great job. I think just to add on that, again, it gives us both a clean starting point and it helps us be very consistent. Whether you're doing an ordinance review or if I'm doing it, they are the same. And that's always great to be able to give to the community, having that sense of consistency and trust. Well, I think we're at the end of our session. I just wanted to say thank you for all of you for listening and realizing that this is the way Celinda and I have worked with each other. We know it won't work for everybody, but we encourage you to find out what does work for you and to remember that those 3 C's are so very important: communication, collaboration, and consistency.
Thank you, Celinda and Roxanne, for a terrific and actually very useful presentation. And I'll apologize to the people that are listening in that we only have time for one question. And the question that somebody asked is, how do you all help cabs feel more like an assistance visit and not an audit? How do you make sure that state and FEMA have the same approach to correct violations in communities? And I'm not sure who wants to take that.
I can start us out, and then Rox, I'll pass it to you. One of the first things I try to do is do homework with the community. I send them through a community assistance worksheet at the beginning of the process before the meeting, so they can provide me with specific information about their community. And then I try to start out the conversation with some tailored outreach, tailored training, to help them get clarity on some things that are confusing them perhaps, or to expand their knowledge on it if possible. The other thing I do is provide templates and tools. So we have a Model Oregon floodplain development permit and a Model Oregon standard operating procedures for processing floodplain permits for local communities. They're examples, but I try to have the conversation with them about why there's benefit to recording those procedures, both for the CAV, but also so that they have consistency in case of turnover. And that really helps them see kind of a dual use of their time and effort. And really, I try to frame it as a discussion as much as possible rather than the firing squad kind of interrogation approach, although I think most people do that. In terms of consistency, typically Roxanne and I have talked quite a bit when I first started doing CAVs about kind of where those lines are, how we are going to address common issues or violations so that we have a consistent approach. And then if we have something really unique come up, I tend to put together a solution with some reasoning, talk to her about this is my proposed approach, this is the reasoning behind it, and then have a conversation about that with her to make sure we're on the same page and that we're going to have FEMA regional support for that approach. Rex, do you want to add anything to that?
I think the biggest thing that I want to add is, you know what, it is an audit. But the thing is it can be handled with care, concern, and respect. So even though it is that hard word, my biggest thing is that Celinda and I both know what you're going through, respect your program, and want to get to the other end with you.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to move on to our next speaker, who is Garyotis, who I hope I pronounced that right. He is the Alabama State NFIP Coordinator and will be speaking on guidance for flood damage prevention and resilience in rural Alabama.
Good afternoon. My name is Garyotis. I'm the Alabama State NFIP Coordinator. I'll be presenting today with Cindy Popplewell from Wood Environmental and Infrastructure Solutions. Our topic is guidance for flood damage prevention and resilience in rural Alabama. Our presentation topics today are why develop a guidebook for rural Alabama communities, what was the process to develop the guidebook, what topics are included within the guidebook, and the next steps to finalize the guidebook's development, training, and distribution. Resilience for recovery from disasters is important for communities of all socioeconomic levels, but especially in communities that have limited resources and are financially vulnerable to impacts of flood events. Often, those communities most vulnerable are the ones that have the most limited resources, including staffing and equipment, to properly plan for and effectively manage their at-risk development. In Alabama, there are many rural counties and towns in addition to some cities with primarily low-income populations that have these types of limitations in administering floodplain management programs. In Alabama, there are 578 census places. 76% are defined as rural, with less than 50,000 in population, making up 98.4% of the land area. For rural areas with populations less than 10,000, that includes 55.9% of the population and 96% of the land area in this classification. For rural areas with populations less than 2,500, that includes 43.5% of the population and 94% of the land area. So based on these statistics, Alabama has a predominantly rural state overall. Therefore, a large number of towns and counties have to deal with limited resources in managing development in floodplains. Rural communities like this are not uncommon in other states as well. During the course of a few years conducting CAVs, CACs, and technical assistance, it became apparent to me that many rural communities are struggling with or having a hard time maintaining a compliant program. We have tried to emphasize that when a community joins the NFIP, its elected officials sign an agreement, which is a resolution, with FEMA to adopt and enforce floodplain management regulations, which is their ordinance. Unfortunately, many of the current floodplain administrators were not around when the community joined the NFIP, and because their predecessors put little or no effort into floodplain management responsibilities, there are many times a floodplain administrator is shocked to find out they even have a floodplain management ordinance, much less know what the requirements within that ordinance are. Once they find out, that just gives them one more hat to wear, sometimes adding to a list of already 5 to 10 duties they are performing as directed by their town council or county commissioners. These rural communities lack the resources and organizational structure within their agency to properly and sufficiently meet the requirements for permitting and enforcement of floodplain development that occurs within their jurisdiction. They also lack the training. There are a few of these communities in Alabama, however, that have overcome many of their hurdles. They have floodplain administrators that are implementing strategies and tools to assist them in keeping their program and their communities compliant with the NFIP. A how-to guide and training workshop is in development to convey those tools and resources to other floodplain administrators in communities where they still struggle and often falter in maintaining compliant development in the regulated flood hazard areas. We interviewed multiple rural community floodplain administrators, both those officials experiencing challenges with compliant floodplain development, as well as those officials that have a good program in place because they have made significant improvements to how they handle floodplain development in rural areas. Our objective has been to develop an understanding of what the issues are that creates the gap between struggling programs and the ones that are successful. We are using those concepts and topics in the guide to assist all floodplain administrators in performing their duties and maintaining a compliant floodplain management program. The guidebook outlines the duties of the floodplain administrator, provides examples of local and technical resources that can be utilized, and provides examples of administrative methods to assist them in the execution of their duties. The goal is to include real-world and tangible examples of partnerships with other agencies and organizations, along with streamlined procedures to help minimize effort but accomplish the identified floodplain management objective.
Thank you, Corey. The process to develop the guidebook has actually been ongoing for several years. OWR began in 2016, working with another consultant, to interview local floodplain administrators. The goal of these interviews was twofold. First, to talk with communities that were experiencing difficulties, folks that Corey knew had been struggling to implement their programs, and second, to interview communities that had developed methods and strategies over the years to successfully handle issues. The first group was asked a series of questions to focus in on where troubles were occurring, and the interview included such questions as, what measures has your community taken to meet NFIP development and permitting requirements, and what, if any, enforcement measures are you taking? The second group was also asked a series of questions, but this time the focus was on lessons learned. An example question includes, what political and administrative barriers did you have to overcome to implement permitting and enforcement procedures in your community? From these interviews, the top comments, themes, and issues for the communities were noted. This assisted with identifying what topics needed more focus on in the guidebook. Where was detailed instruction really needed? Next was development of the actual draft guidebook, and this is where Wood joined in the process. We began with the information from the interviews. We researched existing materials from similar rural communities in other states. We conducted interviews with subject matter experts on rural community development, such as the USDA Rural Development. We pulled basic principles of floodplain management from the Alabama Quick Guide and the Alabama Post-Flood Recovery Guidebook. And we identified online links and information from various FEMA, ASFPM, Corps of Engineers sources, and other applicable organizations' guidance documents that provide basic but essential principles and requirements for compliant floodplain development. We didn't want to rewrite what already existed. We wanted to provide an overview of information, links and sources for existing information, and then also specific details for Alabama communities. We wanted to focus on what did Alabama floodplain managers need to do their jobs well. Once the guidebook was developed, we held a workshop. Wood facilitated a one-day workshop for those floodplain administrators that had participated in the interview process. The workshop consisted of a morning session reviewing each section of the guidebook, a break for lunch, and then an afternoon session for roundtable discussions of what was practical in the guidebook and what wasn't, what additional problems were not mentioned in the guidebook, and other tools and resources that would be helpful. Next, we began the process to finalize the guidebook. incorporating the comments, ideas, and feedback from the workshop, and beginning planning for the distribution of the guidebook and future training sessions. All of that process brings us to what topics are included within the guidebook. We know our local floodplain administrators are responsible for implementing their community's ordinance, ensuring that their community is complying with minimum NFIP standards, and enforcing any locally imposed higher regulatory standards. But how do they do this? We open the guidebook with a detailed list of duties for the local administrator. For each duty, we reference the associated regulation. This may include the federal regulation, the section of the model ordinance, the section of the CRS Coordinator's Manual, or simply a notation as recommended for a consistent floodplain management program. We felt this background information was important. It wasn't that Corey was trying to overload his local administrators. These duties keep the local programs in line with the required regulations, and this cross-reference table helps to demonstrate how. The cross-reference table also notes which section of the guidebook covers this topic and the associated page number. As we incorporated comments from our workshop, the final guidebook includes an additional column for the local administrator to fill in the name and contact information for who in the community is assigned this task. It is important to note that not all of the duties of the local floodplain administrator need to be completed by a single individual. By sharing the workload and keeping track of that information, the burden of floodplain management in the rural community can be lessened. Now, each of the duties in the cross-reference table falls under 6 primary categories: floodplain mapping, regulatory administrative procedures, NFIP regulatory standards, flood insurance, flood hazard mitigation, and natural and beneficial functions of the floodplain. And each of these categories or their associated subcategories includes a general discussion and overview of the topic, additional technical resources, and this can be web links or contact information, and then potential community resources. This may be someone that can answer questions for the local administrator or an agency or department that performs a service. Again, we want to assist the local administrator in sharing the workload and lessening the burden. And in working towards the final guidebook, we are further developing the potential community resource information into a single section of the guidebook to focus on leveraging community resources. Now I will turn it over to Corey to discuss the floodplain administrator duties.
The floodplain administrator duties are very important to understand by the rural floodplain administrators. There are general sources and explanations of the duties in ASFPM guidance, in the state model ordinance, and also in the Code of Federal Regulations. But the primary source for the requirements is included in the local flood damage prevention ordinance. They have detailed duties described there. Specific duties include requiring permits for all floodplain development, review building permit applications and substantial improvements in the floodplain, ensure specific measures are taken to avoid or reduce flood damage, obtain elevation and floodproofing certificates for new development and substantial improvements, ensure that encroachments into the floodway portion of the 100-year floodplain are prohibited if there would be any increase in flood levels, notify permit applicants that other state and federal permits may be required, ensure that the required state and federal permits are obtained, maintain permit records and related materials, and ensure that those documents are available for public, state, and FEMA inspection. So these are critical. The selection of the floodplain administrator is important as well. The duties can be performed in multiple departments or multiple staff. It doesn't have to be all one person. The community could also choose to contract out with other entities to perform their duties. But the primary floodplain administrator needs to be one point person for FEMA and the state to contact for any program related issues, and it should be designated in the floodplain management ordinance.
Thanks, Corey. Now on to the guidebook. I've included here the table of contents. I know this may be a little too small to read, but I just wanted to give you an overview. There's an introductory section, a section on the floodplain administrator, including the duties and cross-reference table that we discussed previously. And there's also a section on how to assign the role of the floodplain administrator and how to share duties as needed. Then there are the 6 primary topical categories and their associated subcategories, and this is followed by the definitions and acronyms, the federal, state, and local regulations, and several appendices with sample documents. The first section is floodplain mapping, and we start with floodplain management concepts. As a local floodplain administrator, it is necessary to understand the basic concepts of floodplain management and why communities must regulate development in the floodplain. This section includes definitions and resources that fall under the realm of floodplain management concepts. Next are mapping concepts. Flood hazard mapping is an important part of the National Flood Insurance Program, as it is the basis for the NFIP regulations and flood insurance requirements. This section provides an introduction to the FIS, flood studies and restudies, flood zones, and flood zone and base flood elevation resources. Specific to Alabama, this section covers the Alabama Flood website and its functionalities. And letters of map change. At times it is necessary for flood data to be amended or revised, and this section discusses that process, particularly as OWR works with FEMA to review all riverine MT2 applications. And now to look at some pages in this section. You can see here the reference text, there are standard graphics, and at the end of this section we have our technical and community resources particular to this topic. Next are regulatory administrative procedures. As we know, communities participating in the NFIP must require development permits for all proposed developments within the designated special flood hazard area. The permit, along with all development plans, must be submitted for approval to the appropriate local authority before beginning any development activity. To address this section covers when a development permit is needed and what that permit should contain, permit fees, an 8-step permit review process, elevation certificates, variances, violations, and code enforcement, and the community assistant visit or community assistance call. And the purpose of those activities are discussed and the items that would be reviewed during that visit. Next, we have the NFIP regulatory standards. This section highlights the minimum requirements for an Alabama community to participate and maintain eligibility in the NFIP. The role of the local floodplain administrator in addressing substantial damage and substantial improvements, and various flood proofing and retrofitting techniques. As a sample, we can see here the resources that go along with the regulatory standards. There are multiple technical resources for the local floodplain administrator, and then a variety of community or county departments that can provide coordination efforts. Next is flood insurance. This section introduces flood insurance and availability, the new risk rating system 2.0, coverage limits, and the increased cost of compliance, the mandatory purchase of flood insurance, and the community rating system. Within the state of Alabama, we have 14 communities in the state participating. Next is flood hazard mitigation. This section provides an overview of the mitigation planning process, information on the Alabama State Hazard Mitigation Plan, flood mitigation ideas, and mitigation funding sources, including all of the HMA programs, community development block grants, and SBA loans. And finally, natural and beneficial functions. Floodplains that are relatively undisturbed or that have been restored to a nearly natural state provide a wide range of benefits to both human and natural systems. This section covers not only the variety of benefits, but also the EPA compliance documentation requirements, especially in conjunction with CLOMARS or CLOMARS with fill. And then just to walk you through some of the appendices, as I mentioned previously, we have a definitions and acronyms section, a section on federal, state, and local regulations. There's an appendices that includes the model flood damage prevention ordinances for both the riverine communities and the coastal communities in Alabama. And we didn't want to include the entire ordinance here. We just had the links to those documents and then an overview of each article. Appendix B presents a sample development review permit process. And Appendix C is a flowchart that walks you through the development review process. Appendix F walks you through how to estimate the water surface elevation in a Zone A. Utilizing the Alabama Flood website, there's a 10-step process for identifying that information. And now I'll hand it back over to Corey.
Section 7 is still under development as we continue to compile information gathered from communities that have developed strategies and tools to overcome their limited resources. This section is entitled Leveraging Existing Community Resources for Floodplain Management. A successful floodplain management program in a rural community will require floodplain administrators to establish partnerships, both internal and external ones. The floodplain administrator will need to get buy-in from local elected officials in order to partner with them in enforcement of the ordinance. Good working relationships with other departments will be very advantageous as well. They may have permits for services that they offer that can be leveraged. They may hold community events where information and outreach can be performed. And they also may have resources that can be shared, both staff and equipment. These are important things to consider. Building relationships with other communities and the private sector can play a big role as well. It's important to find out which companies provide services to the areas in the floodplain and to find communities with common needs or resources that can be shared. In order to overcome the limitations and challenges in managing development in the flood hazard areas that most rural communities experience, the floodplain administrator will need to utilize and leverage resources and services that other agencies or utility companies can offer. The floodplain administrator must also become very familiar with and comfortable with all of the enforcement options that are available to ensure compliant development. That will require communicating the purpose and benefits to local elected officials to get their buy-in to enforcement as well. They are often the ones that halt enforcement actions. These concepts will all be further developed as we gain more input and information for rural floodplain administrators who are already implementing these and other methods in their floodplain management programs. So what are the next steps? First, finalizing the guidebook development. We will finalize the information for Section 7 of the guidebook draft. We will send out the draft guidebook to about 250 of the rural communities in Alabama and request their comments. We'll emphasize that we specifically want feedback on Section 7. We will incorporate the applicable feedback into a final draft and publish it. Second, we will develop training workshops for the guidebook. We'll conduct approximately 2 or 3 workshops statewide and utilize roundtable discussions to get additional feedback for the practicality of the guidance that's been provided in the guidebook. Number 3, distribution of the guidebook. We will post the guidebook on ADECA's floodplain management website. We will share it with the Alabama Association of Floodplain Managers, and we will distribute by mail about 250 to 300 copies to rural communities in Alabama. Thank you for your attention, and if there's any questions, we'll be glad to answer.
Oh, thank you, Corey and Cindy. And you're talking about an issue that is nationwide in scope. A majority of our NFIP communities are less than 5,000 population. So a lot of people wanted to know about the availability. I'm sure a lot of people from other states would like to take your hard work and apply it to their states. And I'm also wondering about how receptive some of these communities have been to your outreach efforts.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that I've talked to. We've mentioned that this is in process, and there is a lot of interest for people to get the information on different resources. And I've provided some of the information to people, you know, in different conversations at conferences and workshops, but it's a needed tool to just provide a, you know, one place to just kind of a compilation of a lot of different information for the resources. But we're going to provide it on our website digitally. It'll be available there. We do plan on printing enough to send out to about 250 to 300 communities in the state. And then we'll also be providing some at the conferences, state conferences in the future. So, but it'll probably be next spring. It'll be about when we finish up, we think.
And then how did you mention how receptive some of the communities have been?
Yeah, yeah. Like I mentioned, just some of the communities that I've been talking to at workshops and conferences are interested in getting this, and some of them actually provide some additional information on either problems they're having or things that they've done in their community to, you know, leverage other resources that aren't commonly used in floodplain management to help them in their program. So.
And just to add on to that, you know, again, our goal wasn't to rewrite anything that already existed. We wanted to, you know, make it specific for Alabama and then provide those resources so they could have everything kind of all in one location and have a good checklist to go by to make sure they were meeting all their requirements.
Yeah, because a lot of these people that we're talking to are like town clerks, city clerks, that, you know, they don't have like a you know, professional building code official or engineer doing the work, or even sometimes a mayor is doing it. So they need something that's readily available that compresses everything into one document.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we'll go on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Jack Krolikowski. Jack is from the state of Georgia, Georgia Department of Natural Resources, and he will be speaking on data-driven decisions, connecting risk analysis to floodplain management.
This is a presentation of data-driven decisions, connecting risk analysis to floodplain management, originally presented June the 10th, 2020 by Jack Krolikowski. I'm an environmental engineer with the Georgia Department of Natural Resources Floodplain Unit. We're the recipients of 2 grants from FEMA, those being the Cooperating Technical Partner and the Community Assistance Program grants. You can see some statistics there that reflect the nature of our work. A little more detail here on the risk mapping, assessment, and planning projects. Those areas in dark green have already been completed. You can see there is a focus in Metro Atlanta in the northern part of the state and the coastal communities in the southeast. The lighter green are those areas that are currently being studied. In the southwest part of the state, you'll see a big endeavor under base level engineering. Those will not inherently update the flood insurance rate maps and flood insurance study reports, so they will give us best available data for local floodplain management and will allow us to prioritize future risk map investment. The Community Assistance Program, for anyone who's not familiar, is all about engagement, compliance, and training with the participating communities, as well as enrolling any communities that may not yet participate. In our state, we have 3 model ordinances, one for the Regional Commission in and around Metro Atlanta, one along the coast, and the balance of the state, which we refer to as riverine. Third bullet point highlights that we have local land use authority, as is given in the second bullet. Those are model ordinances. They are not state law. We have no statewide floodplain management regulations beyond what is found in the state building code. In our state, for reference, we have unincorporated counties and incorporated towns and cities, all of which have local land use authority. Finally, we highlight coordination with other state agencies. This presentation is a part of State Day, so we really wanted to highlight what it means for us to be both a CTP and a CAP grant recipient, as well as our coordination across the state. So here we highlight risk as the intersection of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, specifically in this case, flood risk. So starting with the green circle, we see our role led by the Department of Natural Resources, namely the CTP, that is to develop and disseminate flood hazard data. The pink circle, exposure, led by the Georgia Emergency Management and Homeland Security Agency. That's where the State Hazard Mitigation Officer is found. They're the ones who lead the hazard mitigation assistance work in our state. Last but not least, vulnerability. We see that's mostly associated with the Department of Community Affairs. They're the entity that leads the adoption of the state building code, regional planning, as well as a few other endeavors that we'll touch on during the rest of this presentation. Our objectives, you can see them there: developing that flood data, adopting higher standards, mitigation actions, mainstreaming floodplain management, we'll touch on that. But the big two really are the ones that are bolded: risk reduction and loss avoidance. So by mainstreaming floodplain management, what we really mean is that we don't want floodplain management to be limited to discussions about the National Flood Insurance Program. We really want it to be integrated across any planning or community development activities. You can see we had a big day earlier this year, January the 1st, when the state construction codes through the Department of Community Affairs became the 2018 I codes. Those of you who are familiar with them know that there's several higher standards above the minimum requirements of the National Flood Insurance Program in those I codes, so we were very happy about that. Touching here on the comprehensive planning. Again, don't want to be limited to the county or the state hazard mitigation plan. We want to be involved in any planning that can be done through the utilization of our data. So things like land use planning, capital improvement planning, etc. You'll see this image on the right. It highlights the percentage of jurisdiction structures in the special flood hazard area, y-axis being those percentages, x-axis being a list of communities. This was a deliverable that we made throughout 2019 as we got out in front of monthly meetings of the various regional commissions in our state, and those regional commissions being affiliated with the Department of Community Affairs. These were monthly meetings for their leadership, so they were all elected officials. So we didn't focus on the details as much as just giving them this information, essentially as a call to action to say, hey, this is the information that's applicable to your community. You may or may not participate in the NFIP, but please reach out to us. We're more than happy to enroll you if you're not yet enrolled, talk about some higher standards if you are enrolled, give you best practices, things like that. Additional work with geographic information systems. Spend a lot of time and money to develop flood hazard data in a GIS format. Unfortunately, in our state, many of the rural communities don't have the GIS resources in-house. They turn to the regional commissions for that information. So that was another big reason why we really wanted to coordinate with them throughout last year so that they were aware of all the resources that we can make available to them. Higher local standards, freeboard, factor of safety, most folks are familiar with. So this was some work that we're really proud of that connected our CTP and our Community Assistance Program group. And see what we did here was we identified the freeboard above the base flood elevation to at least meet the 0.2% annual chance flood elevation given by 50,000 or so cross sections in the National Flood Hazard Layer. You can see specifically where they were in that image on the left. Now, why did we do this? So some people will recognize that 0.2% annual chance flood elevation as being reflective of an executive order with regards to critical facilities. So essentially what we said was, when we adopt freeboard, how much do we actually need to adopt at a given location so that we could protect any structure as though it was a critical facility? So that was our mindset. Here's the results of that. We'll start with the pie chart on the left first. You can see we broke down these results by foot integers of freeboard. Green 1 foot, yellow, orange, and then red being greater than 3 feet. What's our takeaway? If we were to sum the green, the yellow, and the orange 3 feet of freeboard, at 97% of those cross sections with that freeboard, we actually would have protected or exceeded the 0.2% annual chance elevation. So that's great sort of as an academic endeavor, but how do we really utilize that at the community level? This is an example for the city of Helen, which is in the North Georgia mountains. Currently, for reference, they have no freeboard adopted. So we're sort of walk through this example, starting with the image on the left, just for everyone's reference. That water is flowing from northwest to southeast, cuts across Main Street, and then continues off to the east. Each of those circles is color-coded the same way as the pie chart was in the previous slide, and each of those circles represents one cross-section in the DFIRM database. That blue star is right at Main Street, both in the image and in the FIS profile on the right-hand side, the only difference there being that the FIS profile would be read from right to left. So looking either at the FIS profile and the gap between the 1% annual chance and 0.2% annual chance lines, or just see it as color-coded in red in the left, we can see that we have a significant backup of water upstream of the crossing at Main Street. So again, City of Helen, currently no freeboard adopted. If we were to walk into a consultation with them, that engagement, we say, not only are we favor of freeboard in general, but in your case, since you're up in the mountains, you have this more contained floodplain where waters are going to rise relatively quickly, not really be able to spread out the way they might in the Midwest, for example, or in our case, in the coastal part of the state. So we'll say, unfortunately, just the reality of your topography is such that not only are we talking about a single foot of freeboard, but we're actually talking about multiple feet of freeboard because you don't get quite the bang for your buck that another community with more gentle topography might. Further work with that, mitigation actions. This is coordination between us and the Georgia Emergency Management Agency. This is their pre-application language for generators and generator switches. So you can see it reads, if located in the special flood hazard area, generators and transfer switches shall be elevated to the 500-year flood level. A state model ordinance coming out of our office says all electrical and other service facilities shall be elevated at or above 1 foot above the base flood elevation. So if we think about our results from the pie chart, that's why we snuck it in here real quick, was that in the area of study, 1 foot above the base flood elevation was actually higher than that 500-year level at 77% of the cross sections, all that green area. So what would we do for the proposed language? Well, why don't we just combine those and take whichever is more conservative? So we'll say base flood elevation with freeboard, or the 0.2% annual chance flood elevation, whichever higher. That way we're meeting both the spirit of our idea of wanting to encourage freeboard, as well as the spirit that GMA was going after of the critical facilities protection with regards to the 0.2% annual chance flood level. The next higher standard we want to talk about is hydraulically adjacent areas. Some folks will talk about this as horizontal freeboard. You can see the language there. That's the narrative that we would include in the ordinance itself. Find it a little bit easier to walk through the sketch for the sake of explanation. So we'll start with the top part of the sketch. That pink dashed horizontal line, that's our base flood elevation at a given cross section. We move down to the lower part of the sketch. We look at the base flood elevation between any two cross sections, lay that out over our topography. That's going to give us our delineated special flood hazard area, that dashed pink area. That's what we're used to seeing on the flood insurance rate map. Go to the top of the sketch again. Now we add our freeboard. Gives us what we'll call the ordinance protection elevation, essentially that base flood elevation plus freeboard. Typically, in most communities, that ordinance protection elevation is only going to apply in the footprint of the special flood hazard area. So what we show as pink. What we're going to propose here is we extend that all the way out until that ordinance protection elevation ties into the elevation at the natural floodplain. We're going to delineate that as well. That gives us the green area in the bottom part of the sketch. Depending on the topography, how sloping it is, that can give us, of course, a considerably wider regulatory floodplain. I'm going to do a little bit more work with these, this time focusing on houses A and B. Do this through an example of a letter of map change, specifically a letter of map amendment. So we'll assume a base flood elevation of 1 foot, just for the sake of the easy math, and then that 3 foot freeboard standard we looked at in our analysis earlier, though it will only be applied in this case in the special flood hazard area. House A, we'll just say a lowest adjacent grade 9/10 of a foot. Within the special flood hazard area, freeboard would apply, mandatory purchase requirement applies, gives us an ordinance protection elevation of 4 feet. House B, shown by the yellow arrow, we'll say lowest adjacent grade of 1 foot. Keeping in mind for a letter of map amendment to be issued, that can be the case if the lowest adjacent grade is at or above the base flood elevation. That being the case, the structure will no longer be considered within the special flood hazard area, so no freeboard would apply. Strictly speaking, no mandatory purchase requirement would apply, be at the lender's discretion at that point, but we'd have an ordinance protection elevation of 1 foot. Essentially, that house could be built slab on grade. What's our big point here? 1/10 of a foot difference in the lowest adjacent grade led to a 3 foot difference in the ordinance protection elevation. Follow up on this example, slight change in the second bullet point there. We'll say base flood elevation of 1 foot, 3 feet of freeboard in the special flood hazard area, and areas hydraulically adjacent. House A, same information, 9/10 of a foot for the lowest adjacent grade. Freeboard, mandatory purchase requirement, we get that 4 feet of ordnance protection elevation. House B, again shown with the yellow arrow, lowest adjacent grade, 1 foot, still get that letter of map amendment issued. Gets us out of the mandatory purchase requirement, again, at the lender's discretion. Freeboard would apply, however, because we're regulating those areas hydraulically adjacent. So we retain that ordnance protection elevation of 4 feet. 10th of a foot difference in this case leads to no difference in the ordnance protection elevation. I think this is very much in line with the philosophy of risk rating 2.0 as we understand it to date. That philosophy being that we're looking for the individual risk profile for each structure. In this case, houses A and B, very similar in their lowest adjacent grades, very similar in their distances to the flooding source, so they really ought to have the same vertical relationship to the base flood elevation, or in this case, the ordnance protection elevation. Further work with higher standards and mitigation actions. We don't really think of the administration of substantial improvement, substantial damage language as a mitigation action, but it really is. It's the simple one that everybody has to do, whether they like it or not, so to speak. So when we adopt higher standards, in this case, the adjacent area, we really want to make sure communities have all the tools they need to successfully administer that higher regulation. So you can see the image on the lower left. This is, again, same color scheme as always, pink special flood hazard area, green areas hydraulically adjacent. And this was our first attempt to lay those out in a risk map project. Took advantage of the flood risk products, which are an additional set of deliverables, though they are non-regulatory, so we have a little bit more flexibility to customize them. You can see this was a gridded product. Had some communication back and forth between the CTP, Community Assistance Program, and that led to the delineated floodplains we see in the second image. Now you can tell that the adjacent area, rather than being gridded, follows the contours just like any other mapped floodplain would. That's how we handle this. Now it gives us a little more flexibility in some of the GIS activities we like to do, intersecting with building footprints, for example. These building footprints that we see in this image come from Microsoft Bing. That was a nationwide deliverable. And so we intersected those with the building footprints and the regulatory floodplains, and then color-coded them as such. One thing to keep in mind about those building footprints, since they were a nationwide deliverable, they were not attributed. By that I mean there's no information associated with them, no addresses, no square footages, year built, etc. So the next step in our process of improvement was to move to this third image on the right. You can see now, rather than having color-coded building footprints, we have color-coded parcels. Those parcels are made available to us through the individual county tax assessor groups for all 159 counties in the state. So what's important about those is those parcels are attributed. So we did the same activity, lay out our regulatory floodplains. Just for the sake of clarity, we turned them off in this case. But again, we color-coded based on the special flood hazard area, areas adjacent, and then blue for those that we might call an unshaded X, so to speak. This is really helpful for us, for example, as we see highlighted for the substantial damage plan, which is now a requirement for the notice of funding opportunity for the Community Assistance Program grant. Sort of builds our philosophy of how we're going to administer post-disaster substantial damage compliance, as well as our blue sky substantial improvement, substantial damage operations. Also allows for the administration of cumulative substantial improvement. In our state, that's a very common higher standard. Metro Atlanta area tends to be tracking for about 10 years. In the rest of the state, 5 years. So also this technique is very helpful for our community assistance visits under the CAP program, because it allows us to do a great deal of legwork ahead of time, so we're prepared with specific areas of interest that we know we want to make sure that we look at very finely in the field. And not that we did this intentionally, but it also happens to be a very efficient way of working remotely during this new era of social distancing. Looking forward, we're looking at more derivatives, how we can customize those flood risk products. It's all about squeezing out as much value as we can once we have the modeling done. Things we're talking about, things like overtopped roads. This is where we have a road with our stream crossing underneath. Typically, we assume those culverts are going to be 100% open. Well, what if we made a more conservative estimate there? Assume they're blocked, send water over the top of the road. If we pick from our topography source essentially the saddle, so the low point in the road and the distance you're traveling, in the crown of the road horizontally, basically that can give us a height that we can delineate an area upstream of the culvert and say, hey, we really don't want to permit anything below that, because we know that if the culvert were to block, that would be a very vulnerable structure. Next one we have here, depth times velocity. This can be helpful for determining appropriate foundation types, for example, as well as some public safety applications for road closures, things like that. Last one we have listed here, vertical changes since last flood insurance rate map. Folks are probably familiar with the changes since last firm, which shows the horizontal changes between subsequent risk map deliverables. Now that we have things like the water surface elevation grids and the depth grids as flood risk products, if we return to an area, we can actually do a comparison of the vertical changes, not just the horizontal changes. Last point we have here, catastrophe probabilistic modeling. This goes back to the analysis we did of the freeboard. Again, we took our base flood elevation, added freeboard above it to meet or exceed that 0.2% flood elevation. But what we didn't do was actually identify the probability of occurrence or the recurrence interval of that new ordnance protection level that we determined with the freeboard. So we know it's essentially greater than or equal to the 500-year flood elevation. But is that 501? Is that 1,000? Is it even higher? So really what we need to do is run a whole suite of flows, and then we can intercept that height. Again, we think this is very much in the same mindset of risk rating 2.0, starting out on the flood insurance side, but we're trying to be proactive in seeing what that's going to mean for our philosophy in floodplain management moving forward. If you're listening to us live during the annual conference, please feel free to take advantage of the question and answer service. Otherwise, if you're listening after the fact, here's our contact information. Similarly, please feel free to reach out. We'd love to discuss further, and thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Jack. Before we get to a question, I want to put in a plug for the ASFPM's Floodplain Regulations Committee, which over the next year is going to be working on developing a higher standards guide, and certainly some of the things that Jack just talked about will be part of that. So, Jack, we got one question, or time for one question, which is, have you convinced any communities to actually incorporate a horizontal extent at the elevation of the BFE plus freeboard?
So we have an entire regional commission, the Atlanta Regional Commission. It's called the Metropolitan North Georgia Water Planning District. We're not the regulatory entity for them. There's about 5 ordinances, including post-construction stormwater and the flood damage prevention ordinance, amongst others, that they regulate. So part of the good faith letter that goes out to a community is a review of the community's ordinances. So that's sort of the paper trail check. And then our office really works to make sure that those communities have all the tools they need. And that's why we got into sort of the theory of it and then the GIS deliverables to say, okay, obviously we're in favor of this idea, but let's make sure you're equipped to handle it. And so there's admittedly varying levels of incorporation of the data, as Kristen mentioned, in terms of hazard mitigation plans and just local operations in general. But our real goal is to make sure that a lack of understanding or a lack of data is not the excuse for that not to be done, right? Because at that point, then it's on the community. They were informed and equipped. If they choose not to do it, well, that's a different issue, and it will be handled as such.
Yeah, and the data is key, because I've had people here in New York tell me, well, I don't mind enforcing, but I need a map. I need to know what I'm enforcing to.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you, Jack. So we've got one more presentation. It's a fairly brief one. This is by Traci Sears from the state of Montana, Big Sky Country, and it's on a floodplain platform for community information. Take it away, Traci.
Good afternoon. My name is Traci Sears, and I'm the NFIP coordinator for the state of Montana. I'm excited to present on the state floodplain platform for community information. Before we dive into this tool, I think it's important to understand a little about the state of Montana and the floodplain program. Like most states, Montana has seen its fair share of flooding over the years. One of the largest events on record occurred in June 1964. There was a significant amount of damage and loss of life. A few years after the event, the National Flood Insurance Program, also known as the NFIP, was established. Quickly following the creation of the NFIP, the state of Montana also established the Montana Floodplain and Floodway Management Policy, followed by the Administrative Rules of Montana to support it. These regulations laid out the requirements for local community floodplain programs and identified the state agency to administer the state side of the program, which of course was DNRC. Montana implemented rules and regulations for mapping, development, ordinances, and even permitting. One particular regulation requires copies of all permits and variances granted must be sent to the department or to the DNRC. The same requirements also extend to mapping, enforcement, and essentially all of the local floodplain program information, thus creating the program problem for DNRC. How to adequately review the floodplain information coming in, how to properly file the information, and how we can utilize this valuable information. Prior to 2011, most of the floodplain information was coming into the state via mail. Since that time, most of the information started coming in via email or file transfer systems. We struggle to keep up with the volume of information that comes into the Montana Community Assistance Program. There was scanning or downloading information and putting it into specific community files by year after staff review. The only way to review historic information is to look through the files by year. We knew that it was critical to establish a way for communities to input data and for both the state and the local community to use this data. The idea of a GIS-based permitting platform was born. We were looking for a simple way for communities to log in, easily navigate to a location, create a point, upload documentations and pictures, and a way to view and query the information in relation to the special flood hazard areas. Simple yet effective program, and everyone was doing it. I was assured as I started talking with our IT liaison that this would be a simple project. We came up with a project plan and cost. We were young and excited and presented this amazing, terrific project to FEMA. The first 2 months were perfect. The project charter was developed and the prototype completed. We were rolling along with federal cash in hand, a kicking project, and of course, momentum. And then, like all great stories, it came crashing down. And here are the greatest hits from this crash. The first item that we easily identified was that the two project leads in DNRC were not on the same page. It was my understanding with this project that we wanted a completed platform that was ready to be used, and we could simply move all participating communities onto it. The IT liaison was thinking that this project was to come up with more of a concept program for just a few communities to utilize and maybe look at upscaling it in the future. The second issue is that the proposed funding request included the use of the DNRC general IT staff to create the final product. Unfortunately, 2 months into the project, we found out that we could not use them because they are directly paid from our indirect costs. And thirdly, the IT committee sat down with the two project leads and explained that this project would ultimately have to be created as a custom platform. But the custom platform would be expensive and would be the last phase. And of course, it would take a few years to be put together. We were advised to take the following steps. We needed to call in the 3 participating communities identified to use the platform. We would have them review the prototype, and then based on their input, create a useful platform for them to enter and use the data. Their information would be critical to assess the platform and determine the amount of storage that would be needed to house the information. Then we would need to bring in an outside consultant to do the limited solicitation process to evaluate the tool, meet with the communities about the tool, gather the community input, and then put together a business analysis to move closer to developing a custom tool that could be upgraded to include all communities throughout the state. So we had a fairly large project team, starting off with the 2 project leads, the NFIP coordinator and the IT liaison, who was Jamie Ellis. Then we brought on FEMA Region 8, not only for the funding, but we needed them to help provide review and oversight of the project. Our IT committee kept providing us guidance and, of course, a reality check. We brought on 2 data entry temporary workers who specialized in GIS. Caitlin and Christina also created a guide that is being utilized by our local floodplain administrators and also our DNRC staff. And their guide that they created is also located on this platform. Our limited solicitation provided the selection of Eddie Smith, who was brought on to evaluate and write up the business analysis. Our record management team conducted all of the scanning for the historical community files that was ultimately inputted by, of course, Caitlin and Christina. Midway through the project, we brought on our floodplain GIS coordinator, Katie, who is keeping this platform up and running and making sure that our layers are still showing up on a day-to-day basis. And our most important component of this project team, of course, is our local communities. Our local floodplain administrators help participate to review the prototypes and then, of course, have been utilizing this platform. There are 2 aspects to this application. The first one is the map-based component. You can review and query information. And the second one is a form-based component where you upload documentations and pin them to their location. The map is fairly easy to utilize. You can search documents by the address, the names, or even by landowner or permit number. And the data uploading tool, we wanted to make it really simple. And so really we have a 3-step process. You can enter information, then you can select the location, and then you can submit the form. Now we want to take a look at the actual platform itself. So here's the permitting platform that we were discussing. This is the one that we are using. It's not open to the public. This is only being used by those local communities that are participating at this time, and also the DNRC staff and some of the FEMA Region 8 staff. You can see that we have 3 tabs here. The first one that we recommend going to is the FAQ. It not only has a very quick YouTube video on how to upload data, but it also has that permitting guide that was created by Caitlin and Christina for our local floodplain administrators to use when they're uploading documents. The first tab on the platform is the Upload tab. Now this is where communities can upload that specific document. And remember, this is a 3-step process. So first they enter the information specific to that document. So what type of project is this? What is the sub-project type? So is it for an accessory structure or residential structure? You can look up the jurisdictional area and the document type. One of the interesting things on the document type is that we received feedback early on for the local communities. They wanted a way to search for LOMAs that were specifically for just land, and those LOMAs that were specific to structures. So we made sure to add those as a separate type of document so that they would be able to utilize that search feature. They can also add in if that project is open or closed, and they can add in general description of the project. Once all that information is inputted, they go to select the location to drop the pin, and then just submit the entry. Now all that information can be reviewed under the second tab. And when you go into the second tab, the first thing that you see is just the state of Montana general overview for participating communities. It's a little bit messy, but I do want to draw your attention to some of the widgets that are below. This is how we can query and research information. This legend that we pulled up is particular to this screen. It's showing you the color coding for all the communities that are identified on the screen, whether they're participating, if they are suspended, or if they are part of the community rating system. So as we go in further to one of the communities, let's take a look at Flathead County, which is one of our test communities, and they are currently utilizing this application. And as we go to that community, you can see there are a number of data or documentation points that pop up. If you go back to this legend, the legend identifies the color coding for each one of these points, and that makes it really helpful. You can also query information. So if you want to look, let's say, for just a floodplain, all the floodplain permits that were issued, and maybe the date on the document, you can create a query for that to retrieve that information. And if you wanted to look up a specific parcel, you could do that as well. So we'll just put in one really quick here. So let's take a look in Whitefish. And as you see, the special flood hazard area layer comes up on the map. And you can see there's 2 document points for this particular property owner. So we'll go back to the legend and find out what do those two dots, what kind of documents are they? So we can see that the blue document is for issued permits. And for the yellow dot, it's actually representative of a LOMA that was issued for a structure. So let's go ahead and take a look at that blue dot for the permit application information. So you have a few pages here associated with this document. And on the third one, you can see that there is an attachment. So if you click on that attachment, that'll bring you right to the permit that had been issued for this particular project. So this information is fairly easy to access. You can zoom in and out on the existing map. It really does paint a nice picture on how we can assess this information. Are we seeing areas that are having a tremendous amount of activity? Is that an area that may need additional mapping? Should we focus on areas that are seeing a lot of development and maybe they might be primed for a mitigation project? So what's next? We're going to continue to coordinate with the test communities. We need to evaluate the prototype or the functioning platform. We need to take this information so that we can put together the parameters to move forward with a customized platform. Then we're going to need to secure the funding for the customized platform. We need to complete the customized platform to include individual community login features, which we currently do not have, a one-point document upload, and a way to move uploaded data into the community file on our DNRC servers. And lastly, we'd like to bring all Montana communities onto the platform. So evaluating the platform, we'll need to identify any additional tools that might be needed, the server space and resources that will be needed for bringing on 136 communities in the future, any ongoing maintenance or future maintenance that might be needed, if we need additional document scanning and the cost for that scanning, and of course, the continued community training. And the data entry needs to be consistent. So we want to make sure that when we're looking at the platform, we're evaluating all these aspects. So where are we at today? We have a working basic platform. We have 2 additional communities that are testing the tool for a total of 5 communities now. The communities are adding in historic and current information, and they're able to retrieve this information for property owners. On the community assistance program side, we're utilizing this platform before we go in to do community visits. So we can search which permits were recently issued and which site visits we might need to conduct before we visit with the local community. So we really are excited about this project. You know, to be honest, it's a little bit different than what I had envisioned in the very beginning, but I'm really glad that we had that reality check early on, because I think moving into this custom platform is going to create a stronger program and a stronger tool that not only the state of Montana can utilize, but also those local communities. And with that, I want to thank you for your time, and I'm available to answer any questions.
Well, thank you, Tracy. What an amazing project. And I'm thinking of just how data intensive it is and how big your state is. Wondered if you can address your plans for extending it further within the state.
Oh, absolutely. Currently, we're looking at bringing on all of our CRS communities, but one of the biggest criteria is that they have to have maps within their communities that are in a digital format. And once we start expanding from our CRS communities, we'll start working even in the current platform with some of our other communities that also have digital-based maps.
Okay, so that's the end of this session, and thank you, Tracy. And I hope everybody has a good evening and logs in bright and early tomorrow morning. Have a good evening.
Thank you.